Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how to conduct a layoff for hourly staff. I am joined by a very special guest, Stan Navrude. Stan, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Excited. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning. Stan is a principal consultant at PRA Advisors. He found huge success in developing and coaching high performance teams, award winning managers, and organizational leaders to build strategic partnerships. His experience in biopharma management has allocated an in depth knowledge of working with complex clients and team members. Awesome. So, Stan, we were kind of talking a little bit before this on the discrepancy between layoffs for hourly staff and just generally talking about layoffs. And I think we'll really have some interesting insight later on kind of what that means. So I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. To give everyone a really quick walkthrough for those that have never been here, we have our webinar platform here. On the right side, we have our chat box. There you can throw in any questions you have throughout the webinar. We'll be sure to have a live Q&A with Stan at the last 10, 15 minutes or so. Hopefully we can get to everyone's questions. But first and foremost, to get everyone acquainted, I would love for you to drop in where you are coming in from. So today I'm coming in, per usual, from Chicago, where it is horribly rainy.
Oh, no.
Not that nice out. But you know what? I expect nothing less from the Windy City. So throw in where you're coming in from. I would love to hear from you all. And then we do have a couple of poll questions throughout the webinar itself as well. Michael, hello from Indianapolis. This is great. Eric, awesome. Sacramento, Samantha, that's great. Guys, keep throwing it in. On the left, we will have some poll questions just sliding up on your screen. It's a really awesome way for us to be able to interact with you all, kind of see where your head's at, be able to, kind of talk out some issues there. So be sure to interact with those. They're an awesome way for us to kind of see where everyone's heads are at. And finally, we do have a handout at the end of everyone, per usual, a little goodie bag, a little take home. We do have an awesome article actually from Workforce on a termination letter to employees, examples and templates. So it really helps lay out what you should be including and, how to more aptly terminate or lay off your employees. It's an awesome, awesome resource for you guys. Awesome. This is so cool. Brandy from Denver. I love it. This is great. Awesome. Thank you guys. For those who are watching live, I'm happy to announce that we are offering those SHRM and HRCI PDC credits. So again, because you're watching this live, I will be shouting those out at the very end of the webinar. If you have any issues or any questions regarding those PDC IDs, feel free to email me at meredith@workforce.com. I would be happy to help you out there. And finally, a nice little bow on all of this. To give a little background on workforce.com, we are an HCM software that specializes for businesses with hourly staff. So really, we run these webinars just as a way to present our own findings, to present some awesome data, some tips and tricks from our guests like Stan. So yeah, we're happy that you guys are all here. Okay, got all that out of the way. Awesome. Stan, I would love for you to tell me a little bit about your background with PRA and just helping companies generally conduct layoffs and what that looks like.
Sure. Well, I'm calling from Kansas City, so go Chiefs.
Love it.
So really, my role with PRA Advisors started after I retired from Eli Lilly and Company after 31 years of a career there. So the last 6 years, I started and am managing principal of PRA Advisors. Our focus is primarily continuing to work in the biopharmaceutical space. We do have conversations around coaching out, layoff, re-engineering, whatever you might want to call it. It still ends up making changes for an organization. For 31 years, I was at Lilly, as I mentioned. The last decade, I was in senior leadership in our managed markets business unit, managing teams of account managers across the country. So everywhere from Hawaii to South Florida, different markets, different approaches to business. Nonetheless, our job was pricing, reimbursement, and access for the entire drug portfolio. So have much experience in hiring as well as coaching out individuals across that decade of time at Lilly. So hopefully I'll be able to provide some insights for your group today.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, what is the biggest misconception that managers have around layoffs, would you say?
Well, the biggest misconception to me is the importance of understanding the business reason behind it, and then and making sure to articulate that to the individual being impacted. This is a personal experience, not only for the individual but also for yourself. It can create much stress and duress, and with yourself as well as your family, and then the teammates who may not be part of that reorganization. So I think it's critical to understand the business reasons first. HR should provide that, whether it's through a verbatim or some form of bullet points, so they can be accurately articulated. And it needs to be done with precision, as well as making sure that there is no variance in the reasons why across the leadership team. So I would say understand the business, understand there's going to be a personal impact, and be empathetic to the individual, because it's your responsibility as a supervisor to clearly articulate the reason and then be able to help out where possible. Now, if it's a fireable offense, it's a whole different story and a whole different conversation. But coaching somebody out, whether it's from a performance reason or because there was a restructure of an organization, it is the supervisor's responsibility to clearly understand, articulate, and then help that individual, whether it's through placing into a different role or exiting them from the organization.
I like that you touched on the fact that it's a very personal experience when, conducting a layoff. For obviously the manager and the employee, it's hard hitting, obviously, at the end of the day.
A lot of work.
It totally is. And I first want to zoom out a little bit to talking about the entire employee experience as a whole, looking at the company from a bird's eye perspective and making sure that that's in place before you go about firing an employee, a staff member. So in the context of layoffs, right, how can leaders actually protect the employee experience for the remaining employees?
Well, I think, again, as part of that process, there is probably going to be some form of communication at a corporate level to say this is coming. Those conversations with leadership generally are weeks in advance of that. And so it's important to understand privacy, as well as continue to be able to conduct in an ethical manner what needs to be done. And generally speaking, there's a conversation with the team, whether it's before or after, to ensure that the individuals who remain are still part of a team. There's always that risk of having an impact that creates more exits. But I think generally speaking, if the supervisor does, again, a clear job in understanding the reasons behind it and provide the business reasons, I think that people are more open to listen and then understand. And it's important to follow up and check for understanding, even though that conversation may have taken place, whether it's as a team or individually across the team.
I love that. And bringing it back almost always to the company values, the mission at hand. I think that's not to give an argument for the employee on why you're firing or, what the reason might be. But I think it helps kind of open the door a little bit to it's nothing personal. Like
Right.
at the end of the day, like this is truly rooted in the company values. This is rooted in what we believe A, B, and C here at whatever company. I think that's a really great tip. So what steps can management actually take to provide solid communication for the rest of the staff and I guess even just the rest of the company?
Well, I think you're right in bringing it back to the mission, vision, and values. I was a Malcolm Baldrige individual that we did a whole restructure of that very point in my previous employer. And I do think that while some people think a mission or a vision is just a number of words, I think it still lays a groundwork for the reasons why and what we're doing. It may be hard to understand, in that emotional point, but it still needs to be the groundwork. It still needs to be the basement of the organization as to where we stand and what we're trying to do. So I think going back to that does provide some framework for understanding, even though not everybody may agree with it. It still becomes really the framework in which the organization operates.
I think that's a great point. I asked a poll question a little bit earlier. I asked which aspect of creating a positive employee experience do you believe has the greatest impact on leaving a lasting impression? And majority of people are saying either opportunities for skill development and growth or a strong sense of community and team camaraderie. And I think the strong sense of community, building that culture, it's really easier said than done. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, just in terms of, where business leaders can actually have more of a say in building that team camaraderie aspect that we hear so much about.
Yeah, one of the things that I think was a strength of mine is building a team brand. We really worked around the idea of what is our team brand?
Mm-hmm.
What should we be known for? What are 3 things that we need to be strong, have strong components in the team that then attracts other individuals to that, or they emulate those very things across the leadership team. So we had multiple conversations, and every time I would hire a new team or there was a restructure and we had to form a team, bringing individuals from other teams or absorbing other teams, I think those are really important meetings to have. And it doesn't have to be complex. It really has to be kind of a team effort. And it's just a wide open discussion about what do we want to be known for? What is your brand? And then I would actually work with each individual on my team to discuss what their personal brand is.
Mm-hmm.
What is the strength? What do they want to be known across the organization as an expert in?
Yeah.
And I think that then demonstrates to the direct report that you're invested in their career, you're invested in understanding who they are. And I think then it has a very positive synergistic effect across the team. Bringing on new individuals to a team, I was always made sure that one of the first orders of business was to establish a peer coach, right? An individual of the team that new person can work with. So while that doesn't really speak to the idea of layoffs and such, I think revisiting that whole process after a restructure or reorganization to reestablish what is the team's brand.
Yeah.
Should it change now because we have a new makeup? But I think that shows investment in the individual and then your personal investment in the team being a high functioning team.
That's awesome. I love that. And every team having their own identifying factors within those values is huge. I want to point, we kind of touched on this actually already. So this first slide talking about protecting your employee experience and brand during layoffs. And this is something that we kind of talked on already, but talking about communication wise, like what are the 3 things that really help give employees forewarning, clearly outline the rationale behind the decision, and aim for one wave of redundancies. Stan, is this something that you're kind of seeing and, mimicking what we were talking about even earlier?
Yeah, I think the number one, give employees forewarning, and that's where HR is a critical component of that process. What are the key points that you want to be articulated?
Mm-hmm.
How can you ensure that you have consistency across the leadership team to ensure that people understand what that is? Outline the rationale behind the decision. That speaks to the ideas to keeping it from a business perspective, why this is happening, and ensuring, again, those points are clearly communicated.
Mm-hmm.
And then the best way to aim for having redundancies removed from that is to check for understanding, clearly communicate the importance of what's happening, helping that individual possibly get placed in a different part of the organization or exiting from there, but making sure that the communication is clear and concise. And then, like I said, check for understanding, but then check again.
Mm-hmm.
I have an example that we can talk about where clearly, not the individual did not understand that they had resigned after a 1 year of a performance plan that they were not executing on. But whenever you want to talk about something like examples, I'm happy to bring some up.
Yeah, I mean, I always love a good example.
So this was an individual who would have qualified not only for the minority group member laws, but also as an age-related employee. So it was really a kind of what I would consider a very particular, but also very specific reasons as to why it was all based on performance. Mm-hmm. So all those other elements of the employee need to be taken into consideration. And again, making sure that it's not personal. So I work extensively with HR. When the individual finally realized that it's time for them to either resign or they were going to be exited from the organization, They did give their letter of resignation through email, and so I verified that they received it, and they understood that, going forward, that they are to do this, that, and the other thing as required. This was the week before we had a national meeting in San Diego, and as I'm landing in San Diego, I get a phone call from my supervisor saying that this individual showed up to the meeting, and that they were in the meeting. And what are we doing? How come he's here? So we had a conversation with security before my arrival. They came with me into the meeting. There were probably 100 people in the meeting. Everybody was really confused as to why this individual was here. So after I explained to him that he and his wife were not allowed to be on the premise, nor could he participate in the meeting, we decided that they could stay the night since they had already checked in. They would not be charged for that night, but they were to leave the next morning. And we made the decision, or rather I made the decision in working with HR, that this person could attend the general welcome reception so that he could say his goodbyes. And it was not awkward, or he was not exited from the building. So I guess, in some respects, it was my responsibility to make sure that it was clear. I thought I had done that. Are we going to have, a clear exit of an individual?
Right.
But this is where HR can play a critical role. And what are my options? What can I do? What can I not do? And what's the right thing to do from a personal standpoint? Not kicking him out. He had to leave the meeting before we started because obviously trade secrets, but not having he and his wife move from the hotel. We could charge him for it, but we chose not to. And then he was allowed to come to say goodbye to his friends. And I thought it actually worked out quite well. But making sure that we're not overreacting and having HR explain what my options truly are.
I think that's such a great tip for HR in general, to be able to take that into consideration. I want to talk a little bit about compliance protocols and flip the script a little bit. So during the layoff process, obviously, there's a lot to be considered, especially within these hourly wage industries that we're kind of talking on, healthcare space, hospitality. So what compliance protocols should upper management pay special attention to, do you think?
Well, I guess, and obviously HR is important in trying to train the leadership team about these things. We did extensive training around that. These are all, I think, important laws that are based, again, on making sure that the individual is noticed as an individual, and that there should be no reason outside of just performance or a business reason for the layoff to take place. And it can't have anything to do with age or race or anything else. So I just think it's really important for HR to remember that these are not always front and center of how a leader is going to think. And so being available for a consultation or having continuous training for supervisors, I think, is critical, because we don't want to have something that happens by accident that creates a whole legal concern.
Of course. And we actually had a webinar last week, and it was a labor law specific one for California. And we talked a lot about how, obviously, at the end of the day, HR, managers, business, whatever, they're not trying to break any sort of compliance. But there are really strict labor laws, especially when we were talking about California. There's so many labor laws to be taken into account. And I think these three are really good to just kind of run through, reviewing federal and state WARN regulations, review ADEA and OWBPA regulations, and then, of course, determining severance package, if that's applicable, benefits, any of that, any additional services. So running through these 3 points, and I know, of course, there's point 1A, point 1B, point 1C within each of these, but I think it's so important because really at the end of the day, employees are doing a great job, especially hourly employees are doing a really good job of educating themselves on some compliance protocols that should be taken in consideration. And a lot of lawsuits going on because of it. I think it's so interesting. So my question for you, Stan, is how can frontline managers actually ensure that they're adhering to labor laws while still managing the transition for, obviously the impacted employee or employees?
Yeah, this is an important part of HR and leadership partnership through these times where there are layoffs taking place.
Mhm.
And I can't stress enough the importance of continuing education around this, being available. There were multiple meetings that took place in advance of the execution of a layoff. I remember. You might think you remember those things, but just it's important for HR to go through those over and over again
Yeah.
because the importance of remaining compliant, especially during such an emotional event such as this.
Yeah, for sure. So when conducting layoffs, what steps can HR actually take to communicate the changes, scheduling shifts, whatever, and responsibilities to make sure they're actually communicating it compliantly and make sure that managers are all on the same page? What do you recommend there?
Well, there could almost be a script that's associated with that conversation with the employee. Making sure that uh, these regulations are verbalized to the employee.
Mhm.
That we understand this, and this is how you're covered, and we're ensuring that this is not part of that process. And here's the business reason once again. So I think it's important to then not only become very clear about what these regulations are that a supervisor must follow, but in the appropriate situation, making sure that the employee understands that these are the protocols, these are the regulations that we follow as an organization.
Yep.
Do they understand that? And then even in some cases where I have experience working with individuals as I was coaching them out that really fall within these regulation requirements, emailing those things to that individual to make sure they understand that we are compliant in this element of these regulations.
Yeah.
Do they understand that? And again, requiring an email back to verify that as, I think an important coverage point for that process.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think confirming on both sides, expecting that email back, expecting that text back, that message, whatever it is, having that verbal seen, yes, got it, whatever it is huge for, again, that communication. It's a two-way street. And at the end of the day, a mass email that's being sent out from your HR or from an operations manager, or someone even in the C-suite, it needs that response to make sure that everybody is truly on the same page. I think that goes really overlooked.
Yeah, and I think that again, the purpose for that is that anything like that is discoverable, so that's evidence to say that yes, we are compliant, and the employee has verified.
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree. I asked a poll question asking, which strategy do you prioritize to protect against potential disgruntled employees? And I sent out this poll question and automatically answer A, which is proper documentation and record keeping, just went almost all the way up to 60%. Now we're getting a couple answers that are saying timely and empathetic employee support during transitions. I think that's really interesting. I'd actually love to hear from the audience, what does that look like? What do those transitions, that support look like? Is that coming from managers? Is that coming from HR? I would love for you guys to throw in any ideas or comments you have on that in the chat box. But yeah, I think documentation is obviously huge. And, that's where workforce kind of comes into play here. We actually had a really interesting client. We had this client called COVID Check Colorado, and they're an awesome organization within the healthcare space, of course. And they love the document management feature that we actually have on our software. And it actually keeps everything in order. And when you're offboarding an employee, which is obviously another feature within Workforce, it actually has all the documents within it just managed, organized. So the CHRO over at COVID Check was able to aptly respond and make sure that they're remaining compliant. So it was all in one place, right? And it was all automated and all made sure that, okay, this is what's happening. Obviously, it was put into the system that this person's being laid off. So the document management feature kicked on into gear when the offboarding took place, and it was great. And it was, obviously a very smooth transition. But of course, concept like COVID Check, there was a lot of turnover going on. So it was very important that they had everything compliantly and in order. Yeah. So I'm curious, talking a little bit about backlash and, people are talking about disgruntled employees and making sure that they're empathetic to those employees, it can actually kind of harm the culture at the end of the day, possibly even security breaches. We were talking about this the other day, Stan. So what strategies or even communication practices can managers implement to address employee concerns, provide that support, reduce the likelihood of compliance related issues, anything of the sort? What do you recommend there?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's important to, again, check the temperature of the team that remains. We talked about that a little bit before. There's always going to be some form of disgruntlement because generally I think it's based on fear. It's also based on concern as, okay, now what's next? Or how are my colleagues going to think? What are they going to think about me now that I'm not working there any longer?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you need to have an opportunity for the individual who's being exited to meet with HR and talk about those very things. And then it provides, so as a supervisor who is coaching somebody out, making sure they understand what services are available to them, whether it's job placement or whatever it might be, or even a conversation with HR to air their grievances if that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important part that HR can play, where they become a neutral body that gives that individual an opportunity to either complain about the company or complain about the supervisor or whatever it might be. But I think kind of framing it in the context of, as an organization, we're trying to learn. Again, this is the business reason. It's not personal. That's a whole other conversation if it's a performance reason, and that should be documented and thorough throughout that process. It should never be a surprise. But if you have an individual who's being exited out because of a layoff, giving that employee an opportunity to speak with HR if that service is available, and letting them know that we want to know how to do this better. Now that doesn't always kind of comes off as being a little flat, but I think it's really important for the supervisor to demonstrate empathy through that process and giving them that out to explain that. So that would be what I would suggest.
It's interesting kind of hearing that suggestion and comparing it to a couple of people in the chat box throwing in what they've actually done. Janice said having a local temporary service agency available the day of the layoff or the state employment agency to help on job seeking. I think that's really cool. I love the idea of using an employment agency actually to kind of come in and be like, okay, we're here to support your next move. We're obviously moving them off the payroll, but here is what they can do. And I think that's awesome, Janice, that your company supplies that. Amber said collaborative support from management and HR. The intent is to present a unified message from the top to the bottom of the organization. Again, talking about those values, right? That top bottom communication and bringing it all the way from the top to the bottom. It's huge. I think that's awesome, Amber. Cynthia said, depending upon circumstances, deciding to not challenge unemployment claims, informing employee of the rehire eligibility status during their offboarding process, and helping employees with resume updates, having all references requests come through HR and providing only neutral references. That is so awesome. I mean, you guys definitely have a really in-depth offboarding process. Stan, I'm curious what your thoughts are on any of those comments on, if this is something that you've seen, if you can embellish on any of them.
Yeah, again, I think it's important for HR to let the supervisor know what are the services available, and then being clear with the individual what is available to them. Somebody said extended access to EAP. I mean, I think those are all important services that should be offered if they are not. And again, understanding what is available. The one thing I think a supervisor should always remember is that if you hired this individual, you are responsible for placing that individual, whether it's within the organization somewhere else or helping them with that offboarding process. And that's where HR could be a huge teammate. I have an example of an individual who was on a performance plan, and my supervisor was trying for me to expedite the exit. But this individual also had a chronic illness and was fearful of losing his insurance. So we did a very thorough evaluation of skills and opportunities within the organization, and ultimately were able to place him and remain in the organization in a role that was more commensurate with his skill set.
Wow.
And so for that reason, I think it's, again, to understand the whole individual and, what their fears are when it's appropriate. There's plenty of examples, I'm sure the audience has, where you have massive layoffs that don't give you that luxury, but you still have the opportunity to have that one-on-one conversation with the individual who's leaving. And I think showing empathy, providing what services are available, whether it's, like you said, an external entity that can help with that process. I think that should be something where HR has, a series of bullet points available and a communication that will share that subsequent to the conversation of that layoff.
That's a great point. If anyone has any examples, similar to what Stan was saying, feel free to throw those examples, those stories in the chat. I would actually love, it'd be kind of cool to be able to unpack those at the end of the webinar, and talk through what those layoff processes look like, maybe where there could be even some room for improvement, or if they just hit the nail on the head. If you guys have any stories, throw them in the chat. That'd be really cool to unpack. I want to go into talking about exit interviews and feedback. Turning to this next slide, my question for you, Stan, is what are some key best practices that we should consider when conducting exit interviews, and how can these practices actually help organizations gather insight and just improve the overall employee experience, kind of throwing it back to the beginning of the webinar?
Yeah, I think define and share the purpose of exit interviews with your team. I think, again, any good organization wants to continue to improve. And so making sure that is available. Though some individuals will choose to not participate, and that's their decision, and that's fine. But I think having the opportunity for feedback, and I do think that it should be conducted by a neutral party, not necessarily, obviously, by the individual who's conducting the exit interview or conducting the actual layoff. So having that individual have a resource to be able to express grievances or concerns or frustrations, whether it's of the company or the supervisor, or how the whole organization handled the layoff. My experience is that those do not take place very often because people are already out the door mentally and they want to just get going with the next step of their life. So, but having that as an opportunity to do that, I think, is important. And then in that interview too, if there are feedback points for the supervisor or the organization, I think if it's available, HR should provide that so that we have kind of a general idea as to how this was perceived and how can we learn as a leadership team to do it better next time. So I don't remember any time that exit interview information was ever shared with me or my colleagues. And I think that's a miss in my organization, my previous organization. So I would encourage HR to, where appropriate, share that information, whether it's personal or whether it's organizational. How do we get better so we do it more empathetically that next time?
Yeah, I think number one is a little tricky, define and share the purpose of exit interviews with your team. I think people often get a little nervous about that, and rightfully so. I think a reason for a layoff, like we were saying at the beginning, is incredibly personal. But at the same time, without communicating, hey, this person's getting, got let go today. If you see them, please be sure to, send them, a thank you for working with us, something of note. Doesn't need to be necessarily specific as to why I would have to argue, they got laid off if it's a little, hard of a situation to explain to your staff. But I think letting them know and giving them the wherewithal to have that moment with their employee, with their, coworker that has been let go, I think it's huge. And it really feeds into the idea of transparency. It feeds in the idea of overall culture. I think it's super important.
Yeah, and on number 3 too, if I might, we had a massive restructuring one day, and I think we had, I was in Las Vegas for a conference, but I holed myself up in a room for 3 solid days from 5, talking to my team. Every individual was reallocated, and then they had to re-interview for their jobs and everything else. And it's just an ugly process, but that's how we were doing it, and that's what it took. But it was I wanted to be very clear with the individual that this is going to be a finite amount of time. We're going to talk about these things, and it's not going to be a 2-hour conversation. It will be 30 minutes.
Right.
So I think it's really critical to be upfront with the individual you're exiting, that this is the time frame in which we're doing it. And there will be time in the future, whether it's with HR as an exit or whether it's they want to talk with me personally afterwards, that's fine. But making sure that it's, time bound and brief. I think it's, they have to sit in that experience and understand it, because it is impactful and it is personal. So, making sure you're upfront with, this is the length of time this interview will be conducted. And if there are subsequent conversations that need to take place, they will do that at a later date.
So this perfectly feeds into my next question. And I'm curious, how can HR and operations actually ensure that these laid off, departing employees can actually participate fully and provide super candid feedback without feeling like they're on a time crunch per se? Can you hear me, Sam?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you sent that to the group.
Oh, no, I'm curious.
Well,
what your
I think
thoughts are.
again, I think it's the partnership between HR and leadership that are conducting the exit interviews or conducting the layoff conversations, to have an agreed to amount of time following that conversation. Maybe it's within the next week, you will have these services available, whether it's with HR for an actual exit interview, or with myself for a personal conversation, and take it from there. But I think, again, it goes to time bound so that it doesn't continue. I mean, it needs to be one of those, you rip the bandage off and we go. We don't have time for this to linger as much as it hurts. It's, these conversations need to be finished by, end of business this week or whatever that time is, but making sure they understand that here's what's available.
Sure.
It's HR or me on a separate conversation, and making sure that they take some time to sit within that whole experience, and then come with some questions or some comments about the process or what's next for them.
And what are your thoughts are about outsourcing these interviews to an agency, let's say?
I think that my personal opinion on that is that I think it kind of genericizes the experience. That's where I think HR is critical in that exit interview. We never did those ourselves. Again, it's still a representative of the company, and it's still a representative of HR. And while you can probably carve that out to an organization, and I'm sure there are plenty of good examples where that works, my experience was always in-house. And I think, but then we also did not hear that feedback. And so that's where I would say maybe a third-party vendor does that better and can kind of collate what the general comments are or what the themes were regarding the experience. I'm sorry, my dog keeps dinging the bell to go out on
No,
so
I'm impressed that he's that trained.
Well, she's a Labrador Border Collie mix. She's
my God,
8 years old. And
my!
Taking CBD oil for her joints, but and a little estrogen for her incontinence. But she's still.
I swear, we treat our dogs better than we treat ourselves.
It's true.
Well, that is very sweet. To go back to the idea of feedback super quickly, I'm curious, if you have any tips on how, HR can actually help create more of a comfortable and confidential environment, and, during these exit interviews that actually helps uncover some potential issues maybe down the line within the company that might not even be detected by HR or operations.
Yeah. Somebody just said, please help her be able to go outside. She likes to just go out and drink water on the deck. I don't know why, but I'll go let her out.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
I think in terms of, again, providing a safe and private environment, sometimes if it's going to be a contentious conversation, having HR in the room is critical. There are examples where I had to actually read script, because it was a contentious situation. HR needed to be present. So I think it's one of those where, as a supervisor assessing the individual and what you expect, you should have a general sense if these people have worked for you for a while. And then work with HR, whether you have to write a script that you read verbally, which I had to do a number of times, or you have HR present to answer questions of the individual that maybe you don't feel comfortable answering. Again, I think that HR plays a critical role in that partnership. But in general, exit interviews have always been conducted by HR, because then that individual feels like, the exiting person feels like they can share anything and everything, whether it's just frustration or a personal attack against the supervisor or the organization. And I think HR does a good job of sorting through some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, because it has to be a neutral body. It can't be just, the supervisor saying it's time for us to cut ties. That conversation takes place, but I don't think the supervisor should said, how can I do this better? Because I think it's going to be such an emotional experience in the time that you're having that having that exit interview conducted, a couple of days later, so that that person can, again, sit within that experience and try to understand and rationalize, so what's next? Or this is where I think they did a poor performance of exiting me from the organization, and I want to know better. I want to understand better what's the business purpose for this.
I think that's a really great point. And even if there's a script that's needed, lean on that, right? And, we kind of touched on agencies and what that looks like. We actually
keeping it brief too. I mean, brevity is critical,
yeah.
because then it minimizes confusion. It minimizes the chance for interpretation that's not accurate. And then follow-up email is important to say, these are the things we covered. Do you understand? This is your end date, blah, blah, blah. Here are services that are provided by the organization. And, thank you for your time.
Yeah. Talking about keeping it brief, we actually had a client of ours, I'll keep them anonymous, but they actually laid off a good amount of their staff, unfortunately, in the midst of COVID. And they really utilized this shift feedback feature that we have within the employee app side of things. And with understanding that it was going to be their last shift, they sent out this employee feedback that they sent out almost at the end of every shift. It's a really awesome way to get feedback just generally. But it was some really honest responses, and not necessarily disgruntled or jarring in any sense, but they really were able to pinpoint some issues that they had within their culture, within their organization, based off this really quick feedback that they were getting. They didn't necessarily have the time or finances to conduct exit interviews for each employee that was getting laid off, but they were able to quickly send out an employee feedback survey after having been told, hey, this will unfortunately be your last shift, but we would love to hear from you on your own time. Feel free to, share the survey with us. So that's exactly what they did. They were able to really get some great feedback. And actually, as they started onboarding employees after the fact, a couple months, about a year down the road, they were actually able to use some of that feedback to garner it and apply it to their, newfound culture, their newfound organization. So I do think that there is something to be said, especially within hourly workforces, right, where time is money and there's only so much time and so many resources being allocated towards offboarding employees for obvious reasons. And I think using something like the shift feedback feature that we have on our software is huge. It saves so much time. It saves a ton of money at the end of the day, because managers don't need to be pulled aside for 30 minutes to maybe even an hour and a half, depending on how much the employee has to say, where the employee can write it all down or, submit even a kind of thumbs up, thumbs down situation on what their experience was like, what they didn't like, all that good stuff. So
sounds cool.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So what strategies can managers actually employ to ensure that exit interviews focus not only on the individual experience, but also kind of capture broader trends and patterns to help make those improvements across the company?
I don't think I have any specifics to that effect, but I do think, again, when an individual is given the opportunity to have an exit interview with HR, I think the most important point, whether it's HR or a third-party outsourced service, that there is some way to collate learnings so that we can use those in the future, knowing that that could happen in 6 months or 6 years, but nonetheless, there should be a continuous improvement process. There are various levels of experience in leadership, and people are compelled to do the best that they can do. But if you don't have a mechanism to learn and continuously improve, then I think you get the same thing over and over. So having that feedback, I think, is going to be important, and can be used as a training mechanism for future experiences that are likely to take place.
Also, just super quick, I just want to shout out Melanie in the chat, asked a great question. Melanie, I'm going to tag that question, and I will get to that at the very end for the Q&A, which we'll go into just in a couple minutes here. For those that do have questions, guys, feel free to put them in the chat. I would love to hear from you all. Also, Melanie, I love how you spell your name. It's so pretty. Okay, continuing on. So once collected, how can we actually analyze the feedback that was given to, better enhance the company within these exit interviews? What steps can be taken there?
I think, again, I don't have a lot of experience in that because we never really received feedback. But we did have conversations as a leadership team following it. So we were sharing the experience across the leadership teams. If HR is not providing that, I think it's critical that the leadership team has kind of a powwow afterwards to say what went right, what went wrong, how would you do it differently? How did you handle this individual, knowing that person was going to be disgruntled? Disgruntled. But having a mechanism for the leadership team to come back together and share good ideas so that we can continue to learn if that learning opportunity is not provided by HR or another organization. So you can kind of do it yourself, right? So, you're not operating within a vacuum. You generally will have a team of leaders that's been charged to execute on this layoff process, but then having an opportunity to come back, whether it's, going on a retreat to talk about this in a more casual setting. What are the top 5 things we can do better next time? And then as a collective leadership team, being open and sharing those things and say, this was a pain in the ass because I didn't have this, that, and the other thing that HR didn't provide. And then bringing those to HR to say, in the future, please have these things as part of kind of an exit package or like a layoff package for leadership, so that we can all be consistent with the effort, so people don't have different experiences, because the exited employees are going to talk, or they're going to go on Glassdoor and complain, or whatever it is. But I think, having an opportunity for the leadership team to come back together and say, what were some of the biggest challenges that you experienced, or how did you do it really well? How come these people are feeling comfortable after that experience? What did you do to share that reason with the employees, so that it was an easier process for both the leader and the direct report?
Yeah, I think taking note of those smaller moments in between the exit interviews and the actual laying off, where it's slight improvement every time, and implementing that into the next one, or future, whatever it might be, and actually creating that plan around it, right? Creating an offboarding type of plan that, hey, this is what we need from HR, this is what we need from the managers, this is what we need from C-suite, upper management, whatever it might be, and actually compiling those notes into a shared document. Again, keeping those documents and notes in order is huge. Learning from agencies and actually being able to apply it internally within your company, having somebody just dedicated to, obviously the hiring and offboarding process, I think is really important, and making sure that they're following some sort of auditing, some sort of compliance within their company, I think is really, really cool and important. So my last question for you, Stan, is what are 1 or 2 top tips, actions, or takeaways that you can leave the audience with in better conducting a layoff?
Yeah, I think we started with the idea that communication is critical, explaining the business reason for the layoff, having clear, concise bullet points or a verbatim or whatever it might be to ensure continuity across the leadership team. And then making sure that this is a personal experience, not only for the individual being exited, but for yourself. So I think it's important for self-care in this process. I think you need to give yourself more time to do this than just, okay, we're doing all this tomorrow. I think it's really important to remember to share the business reason and to make sure that you keep it personal from the individual standpoint, but don't take it personally, because some people are going to have an emotional response, the old amygdala hijack, where they just didn't know. Well, they should know, because if leadership as C-suite has done a good job of setting up the structure for the process, it shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah.
If it has to be a surprise, then that becomes a whole other process, and that does take place sometimes. But those would be the points that I would use. And then as a leadership team coming together to kind of do an assessment on how it processed, what did we learn, what we do differently, and what is feedback for HR that we can provide so that we can do a better job next time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Awesome. We're going to open it up to the Q&A. We have a question live from Melanie, and then we have a couple emailed in questions. If anyone else has a live questions, feel free to submit it in the chat box to the right. We would love to hear from you guys, and we will be sure to prioritize those live over those that are emailed in. To go to Melanie's question, how would you handle laying off an employee with a poor work performance record and is a close friend of the company's owner? That is a really interesting situation.
That's a tough one, and I think it's one that requires kid gloves. But if they're on a performance plan, it's critical to document those conversations. Lily had a really good competency model kind of set up where there was various ways that you could process through a career, but there were very specific key criteria, skills that needed to be met. So, when you're on a performance improvement plan, the competency model or whatever skill set, whatever you want to call it, everything should be aligned to the comp model in terms of where they are relative to peers within that position that they are. And so documenting their progress in that. And I think my advice on that is that the documentation should be coming from the employee in terms of what they're doing, and then your assessment and response in all on email, so that can be very clearly defined, but also, again, discoverable if there's ever an issue with the lawsuit. When it comes to an employee who's friends with the owner, my hope is that owner is going to be willing to sit down with you and go through that documentation as it's aligned to the performance improvement plan and how they're progressing. It's one thing, again, to have a fireable offense and that there's no ifs, ands, or buts, that this is it, and then you're gone. But if it's a performance improvement plan and it's been documented and you have evidence of poor performance or performance that is time-based, that they're not exceeding or meeting, then that should be a conversation that you should be able to have with that owner and share why, so that they can, take an objective view, even though their friend may be impacted.
Again, this is such a good example of making sure that top-down communication, talking about the values specifically of the company, would play beautifully here, because we're talking about the company owner, right? The person that instilled these values to begin with. I think bringing that into the conversation and presenting it to the owner and saying, this person does not meet our main values that, obviously they helped create, they had a big say in, and here's why, and laying that out and making sure that they're truly on the same page. This owner is on the same page as you and the team before conducting this layoff, I think is really huge. And then, of course, presenting a similar layout, a similar finding to the person who is being laid off. I think that tip would be huge for, this situation. And it's as Stan said, handled with kids' gloves, I think is really important.
And I think it's important to if possible, to align the performance issues with the business output, right? Mm-hmm. So if it's a quota-based situation, these are the numbers. If it's a personal situation, This is how it's impacting the team.
Yeah.
Whatever the issue might be. But I think, as you're talking with the owner, they're going to, whether they have shareholders that they have to answer to or private equity that they're answering to. If it's business related, it should be something that can be demonstrated in numbers. If it's personal related, it should be demonstrated in impact on the team or the organization. And it's not an easy conversation to have, but I think take the personal element out of it and talk in terms of the context of the performance, not about the person. Yeah,
that's a great point. We have an awesome question from Michael, and this might be the last question. So until, I'll wrap us up. But Michael asked, do you think the typical manager is equipped to deliver a layoff? Would you recommend this conversation should be led by HR with the manager present, or is there value in having the manager deliver the message? That's a really great question, Michael.
I think, again, a new manager, if they have not been trained effectively, I think having HR present is important just from a liability standpoint. And it's not like you're going to do something intentionally. You just do something because you're not trained on it.
Right.
I think it's important, any supervisor, manager, director, whatever you want to call them, to have that experience, to learn from that experience, and to conduct that experience. If you're uncomfortable, having HR present, I think, is important. A good organization should have an onboarding process for any supervisor or leader, because it's in the best interest of the organization from a liability standpoint. So, self-assessment of, am I equipped? If I'm not, where do I get training? If there's no training, can I have a supervisor or an HR representative present? I think that's all important. I mean, I have a great example that my son had. He was 27 and working at a tech organization, and he had to lay off a gentleman who was 45. So we talked through that and, figured out, how do you present it? Making sure that we talk about business related, not personal related. But I think he grew substantially from that experience. So any chance there's an opportunity to be part of that, not that you would choose to, but I think it's a good leadership skill that everybody who wants to be a leader or a supervisor should, be given the opportunity, or if you find yourself in it, to not shy away from it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And again, I think obviously managers are theoretically going to want to grow in that aspect, in the leadership aspect. So having them in the room, maybe being able to conduct them in the future if need be, I think is a great point, and I think should definitely be considered. Awesome. Well, I don't want to keep everyone past the 11 mark. I've been trying to do a better job of not holding everybody here past 11. So I want to quickly hand out our handout for today, just a really awesome article from Workforce on just termination letters, what they mean, how do we even apply them, some templates there. It's an awesome resource, and it kind of helps bring everything we talked about together. Stan, thank you so much for coming on. I know I learned a lot. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, right? Yeah. I mean, I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.